Hi, everyone. This is episode 2 of our book review of The Call of the Carpenter, 1914, by Bouck. This is a work that is both pro-Jesus and anti-Paul at the same time. Very interesting work. Okay, so we'll begin with this topic. Christianity betrayed from within, beginning with Roman, aka Constantinian Christianity. Page 247. Nothing could have impeded Christianity from the outside obstacles, but bring increase of momentum. The bloodbaths soaked new strength into her sinews. Christianity was betrayed from the inside. Rome insinuated herself within the Christian ranks and there did her work. By reinterpretation of the Carpenter under the pretense of adding to his glory, she exorcised from the magic name its power of evoking democracy. She turned it into a reinforcer of despotism. It was a masterpiece of strategy. The goad which had been pricking the people into unrest was now flail beating them down into submission. Religion, with its powerful leverage on the human heart, no longer urged to liberty and self-respect. It lent its ghostly counsels now to quietism, obedience at any cost of personal values. If the light that is in the world be darkness, how great is that darkness? Wherefore, our judgment of Paul and his fellow Romanists. So what he's basically saying is Constantine and all of those people are following the passages we're going to show you and quote in a little while. And this is based on just the authority of government must be followed at all times. This stands unreversed. Wherefore, our judgment of Paul and his fellow Romanists stands unreversed. Paul the apostle is the term he coveted. Peter and the Galileans in their lifetime denied it unto him. And he's correct. Ambrosiaster says that in his commentary on Corinthians, that the apostles had determined that the 12 apostles had to determine Paul was a false apostle. Now, this is written in the 300s, somewhere in the middle 300s. And it got missed. In other words, there's a purge of this history in every other historical record. But because this was deep inside of a commentary on the book of Corinthians, it was never caught and therefore got through the grid of censorship. And this is a person who was pro-Paul. So whoever was looking at it probably got lazy and thought, oh, this is a pro-Paul book. Well, I don't have to worry. Well, he mentioned something that was something that the church was suppressing. And we have lots of other indications of that right in the Gospels and the letters of Paul himself. Anyway, so Paul the apostle is the term he coveted. Peter and the Galileans in their lifetime denied it unto him and would probably have called him Paul the apostate. And in fact, let's just pause there for a minute. We know in Irenaeus and Eusebius mentioned that the early church, which was known as the Ebionites, had determined that Paul was an apostate, and they said not to read him. And now they don't tell you that it is the 12, it's a church of the 12 and under James, and that's how they were known as the Ebion. Well, we know that independently because Jerome, in his commentary on the epistle to the Galatians, comments on when Paul says he was told by the 12 to remember those at Jerusalem, the poor. He, Jerome, knew who that meant. It meant the Ebion, and he knew they were the same people that Irenaeus and Eusebius are talking about. And he said that these were the 12 under James. So that was clearly understood when Paul said it in the first century that the Ebion were already in existence. They were calling themselves the poor. That was the name of their church. And so when Irenaeus says the poor at Jerusalem had determined Paul was an apostate and should not be read, this is corroborative of exactly where this gentleman, Bouck, is getting this. And Eusebius said the same thing, but did not say with clarity, either purged or what was not originally written. Neither source, Irenaeus or Eusebius' source on the Ebion, states one way or the other who the Ebion were. But we know from history, and like I said, from Jerome, that in the first century, in the time of Christ, it meant the apostolic church at Jerusalem under James with the 12 apostles under him. Okay, perhaps too harsh a term, that latter. Paul did according to his lights, but the lights that were in him were darkness. His niche in the abbey of fame is secure. His literary gifts have secured him that immortality. But the regeneration comes not through rhetoric, the powers that be, there is no guidance in that star. Therefore, the democracy will not be found on Paul. Rather, it will be found on the Carpenter of Galilee, and with him will ask in every age whether the powers that be are the powers that ought to be. So he realizes that the power of the church today is all through Paul and not through Christ. We have a church dominated with Pauline doctrine and none of Christ's predominantly, or he's dismissed to another dispensation, and so his words do not apply to our experience on earth at this time. Next, how Paul's writings supported the change from a democratic to a tyrannical principles under Constantine. So we're going to get into Constantine in a minute, but we need to, where he gets into Constantine, we need to know what he's talking about by knowing the passages that are at issue. So the key is to know what Paul says in Romans 13, 1 to 4 and 5. But so here we go. In Romans 13:1, Paul says, quote, everyone must submit himself to the governing authorities. Paul explains why the Roman rulers are, quote, the ministers of God for your own good, Romans 13:4. So just so we're clear, every nation that he's visiting, where he's living, every place he goes in his missionary journeys, are all part of the Roman Empire. So he's telling people, the Romans, he's telling people who live at Rome, your bosses, your emperors, your Caesars, your Neros, all of them, they are God's authorities. They're governing authorities, and they're ministers of God for your own good. And we're going to quote the passage at length so you can see exactly what he says. But I want you to see something else here. Next, look at Galatians 3, verse 19, chapter 4, verses 8 to 9. Paul says you should not submit to the law of Moses. He's telling the Galatians. That's another province of in Asia Minor and current Turkey, but then was part of Roman Empire. Paul says in Galatians 3:19, it was merely, the law of Moses was merely ordained by angels. Paul says, do not submit to those who are not God's, Galatians 4, verse 8. And that's because the Galatians wanted to observe Sabbath. And he's saying, what are you doing, you foolish Galatians? Haven't I told you that, basically the law was given by angels through mediator Moses? And now why do you want to go back and be subject to those who are no gods? Why do you want to be subject again to the weak and beggarly elements? And elements is a word that Vincent Word Study says is a word in both Greek and Latin that meant the angels. So when we look at Romans chapter 13, Paul says you should submit to the governing Roman authorities as ministers of God. But you can see he says the angels of God are not ministers of God at all. They are no gods, and you shouldn't even care what they say. And Rome's going to dictate how we live, and that's how we should obey them, not the angels, not the law given to Moses. That's the clear implication. So you can understand now why Paul's importance rose and why Constantine insisted his works, or the people around Constantine, let's just put it that way, who wanted to conform Christianity to Roman rules and law, wanted Paul more than anyone else to be in the Bible. And so as the Constantinian Bible emerges in 331 AD, which apparently is the Codex Sinaiticus, and maybe likely the Codex Vaticanus, but clearly the Codex Sinaiticus fits into this picture, and he is now attached to the other gospel, to the Gospels and other materials in the New Testament or New Covenant Scripture. But let's watch. Now we're going to take a break here. Now we'll read the full context of Romans 13, 1 to 5. Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Again, I want to repeat, the only government can be possibly talking about in writing the Romans is the Roman government, the Rome, imperial Rome. Consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. So basically, I just want to add this here, is he's saying this in a universal way, even though he's clearly only talking about Rome and the Roman Empire at that time. He's saying government in all times, all eras, and even in our own era, is instituted by God because it's just a principle. So that means that you could have the Nazi government. You have whatever he's going to tell you you have to do here, you have to do to the Nazi government. You can't be like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, attempt to assassinate Hitler, to stop this madman, right? No, that's would be contrary to this rule because that's your governing authority. You're just, it's like shooting God. That's what he's saying. For the one in authority is God's servant for your good. So Hitler was in authority for our good. If you trust Paul, which at this channel we do not, that's what we're teaching you, that he is contrary to God's word. God does not say that everything that human agents who are governing authorities are from God. In fact, that is completely contrary. Where Abimelech was told by Jotham that you would do all kinds of evil, and he was somebody who was trying to become the first king of Israel, and the prophet Jotham condemned him that he was going to do all this evil. And so the book of Kings is replete with kings who do all kinds of criminal acts and evil. And yet Paul's saying that they're the servants of God and they're from God and they punish the wrongdoer. Well, they punish the wrongdoer as they see it, but they see people who are really just and righteous being subject to the death penalty. I'm gonna read you after this a portion of the law, the legal status in 1926 of the family in Russia had been so altered by the communists that it was now in total chaos. And you want to say that changing these laws, which were in the Ten Commandments, were justified and led to a society that God approved of because these are agents of God because they're a government. The Bolshevik government was a legal government of Russia. Okay, so to disprove what Paul is saying, I mean, I told you all the biblical examples, but here is a modern example. The Russian effort to abolish marriage. This is the Atlantic magazine, the July 1926 issue. Do you see that over here? And it says, and in that article, that title says, quote, men took to changing wives with the same zest which they displayed in the consumption of the recently restored 40% vodka. By a woman resident in Russia. July 26 issue. The question whether marriage as an institution should be abolished is now being debated all over Russia with a violence and depth of passion unknown since the turbulent early days of the revolution. Last October, a bill eliminating distinction between registered and unregistered marriages and giving the unmarried consort the status and property rights of the legal wife was introduced in the ZEK, or Central Executive Committee. So let me tell you what's going on here is you could have unregistered marriages but no rights. So you're literally, it was no different than being friends, and because you had no obligation to the other person, you could just send them away and didn't have to take care of them. So this was devastating for women. Talk about women's rights. So now this change in 1926, or approximately this time, is trying to make things better by allowing an unregistered marriage to become what? To have the rights of property. Okay. So much unforeseen opposition to the proposed law developed that the ZEK decided to postpone its final adoption until the next session, meanwhile initiating a broad popular discussion of the project. So this attempt to correct the effect of these prior rulings or decisions was not even being accepted. So you still had unregistered marriages having the women had no property rights at all. And the men who had money or jobs or whatever, they just can walk away and leave their wife and kids and everything, and they didn't have to worry about their children because they weren't really theirs and they're not legally theirs because marriage in that sense no longer existed in Russia. Since that time, factories, offices, clubs, and various Soviet organization institutions have passed resolutions for and against the bill, and the halls have not been able to hold the eager crowds that throng to the meetings in city, town, and village. So people are saying we need this rule. We need to bring back that women in unregistered marriages should have some property rights, and maybe there should be the children should be. I know we said that they could be unregistered and they just go free, and the father has no obligation. But maybe we need to change it, go back to the way it used to be under Christianity, Christian rulers. Okay. Uh, so I'm just showing you it's not that Christians make big a difference, but it is some difference. And remember, when Paul is talking about Rome, he's talking about a Rome that has no Christian values or rules. Okay. And they may have things that coincide or similar, but it's not a system exactly like the law given Moses either. So anyway, but just to show you, again, the principle of Paul uttered cannot possibly be true as we keep going through this. I just want to show you a couple more things. When the Bolsheviki came into power in 1917, they regarded the family like every other bourgeois institution with fierce hatred and set out with a will to destroy it. To clear the family out of the accumulated dust of the ages, we have to give it a good shakeup, and we did, declared Madam Smitovich, a leading communist and active participant in the recent discussion. So one of the first decrees of the Soviet government abolished the term illegitimate children. This was done simply by equalizing the legal status of all children, whether born in wedlock or out of it. And now the Soviet government boasts that Russia is the only country where there are no illegitimate children. Yeah, just say, oh, well, they're all legitimate. But that doesn't mean anything. It's just a word on a piece of paper. Who has obligations for these children? Okay, let's see. The father of a child is forced to contribute to its support, usually paying the mother a third of his salary in the event of separation. Okay, so that's what's changing. By changing the law that the illegitimate children now legitimate, the men who thought they could have sex have children and have had no legal consequences. Now they're finding out the Soviet government thinks that wasn't such a great idea. So this idea of abolishing family and the father relationship to the child that doesn't exist anymore because there is no such thing as a family. That's what Karl Marx said. That's what he wanted. So the Soviets are saying, hey, we now have to change things. At the same time, a law was passed which made divorce as a matter of a few minutes to be obtained at the request. And I think what she means, at the same time they introduced all these laws basically destroying marriage, they now also had to put in laws that basically allowed you to get a quick divorce in any marriage you were in. So if you did get married, because people still probably try to get married, and but if you did that, you get out very easily. At the same time, a law was passed which made divorce a matter of a few minutes to be obtained at the request of either partner in the marriage. Chaos was the result. Men took to changing wives with the same zest which they displayed in the consumption of the recently restored 40% vodka. Some men have 20 wives living, quote, some men have 20 wives living a week with one, a month with another, assigned an indignant woman delegate during the seasons of the Zeke. I just want to let you know when I lived in the Bronx and my aunt was a social worker in the social services department in the New York Bureau, whatever. There were multiple men who would show up with women. The same, excuse me. There were multiple different women that one man would show up for each one to get his cut of whatever she was getting in her social security check or social, I shouldn't say security, social payments, basically with the children. So let's say there's 4 or 5 children. That guy knew he was responsible for those particular children. He birthed them. Now she's going to be getting money from the state. He shows up to collect the money at the same time she is collecting the money. And my aunt had to work out whatever solutions the government allows for that situation where he's claiming, I'm also the father, I want to get money. What he's really doing is he was studying himself out to as many women as possible. So my aunt kept seeing the same guy showing up with multiple women, and he's making a decent coin every month for all the kids that he had birthed. This is what happens when you have just chaos in the marital realm. People can divorce, people can go engage in sexual relationships, and they can seek all the benefits, and they can, like that, cash payments for social services. But on the other hand, they don't take any burdens either. They're just there to pimp out their bodies. Okay. More than half of them are drug addicts. These are the children. Wait. Let's go back here a minute. They have children with all of them, and these children are thrown on the street for lack of support. There are 300,000 Besbrzorny or shelterless children in Russia today who are literally turned out of the streets. They're one of the greatest social dangers at the present time because they're developing into professional criminals. More than half of them are drug addicts and sex perverts. It is claimed by many communists that the breakup of the family is responsible for a large percentage of these children. But that was their own doing because they undid the laws of marriage when they started. That was how they first started. And by the way, she hasn't recorded that here, and this Atlantic hasn't told you there was a predecessor law that it dissolved the marriage bond, and so now we're looking at the incremental changes to try to bring back some sense of responsibility for the husband for the children he sires, and people can't just divorce on a whim and just by filing a piece of paper. All right, I'm going to leave it at that, but I'm just going to say, so let's go back to what Paul said. And now with that in mind, I want you to just remember what you were just reading about the chaos of all these laws dissolving marriage and making there was a point, or they're still debating here, to try to bring back what about the illegitimate children? Should we make them legitimate and make the father responsible? That's what they're debating here. And because the children become the real problem when you dissolve the marriage bond. The kids have no authority over them, and the parents have no responsibility either. So it's just this chaos. So with that in mind, let's go read. Were these laws all from God, Paul? That the parent had no responsibility for the children, and there's no marriage to which there was any responsibility because there was no legal marriages anymore. You made it everybody could have as many children as they want in marriage, out of marriage. There was no marriage certificates being granted at a certain point in time. It was love is free and everything like that. That was how the Bolsheviks started, and it's not mentioned here, but that's what's really going on in the background. So let's take a look. Okay, so let's listen again to what Paul teaches us in Romans 13, 1-5. Is this from God? First of all, remember, he doesn't quote Jesus. He doesn't quote God for this. Remember, in Jeremiah 35, God clearly states that unless you say Yahweh said, that nobody has to believe anything you say after that, you are a false prophet and we shouldn't listen to you. There is an exception for the prophet of Deuteronomy 18, 16 to 19. God said there, you must listen to every word he says. How would we know without him saying and quoting you, Yahweh? Don't worry, you'll know. And what did Yahweh do with Jesus in the transfiguration with 3 witnesses, James, John, and Peter? He, in front of them, said, listen to him. The same words are quoted in Deuteronomy 18, verses 16 to 19. He's saying this man is the prophet. You must now listen to every word he says. And that's what Peter teaches us in Acts 3, verses 21 to 23. When he quotes those 3 verses from Deuteronomy 18, he says, to these people who had just been involved in crucifying Christ, that you can repent. And who is Jesus? He tells them, he puts less emphasis that he's the Messiah, and he puts more emphasis on the fact he's the prophet of Deuteronomy 18. Do you know that, my fellow Christians? No, because this is not what people want you to know, that the words of Jesus, every word was from God. That's why he could speak without quoting Yahweh. But Paul here is not quoting Yahweh. And the rule for anybody but the prophet is they must say, Yahweh told me in a vision, in a dream, or whatever. Or if you want, you have to say, Jesus told me, and then we can decide whether you have an authority, familiarity with Jesus, that he's talking to you. And if you didn't know him in this lifetime, Jesus said he's not coming back to talk to anybody between now and the time he ascends into heaven to talk to people. But Paul seems to accept he with Apostle John, he stays up in heaven and he sends an angel down, and the angel talks to John and uses Jesus' voice, basically speaks the words of Jesus or sometimes Yahweh to speak to John. And so a lot of people don't pay attention that it's this angel to whom Jesus is talking. But I digress. Anyway, so so there is no way on God's green earth what Paul is saying here is, number one, qualifies as scripture because it does not satisfy Jeremiah 35, which is really also in the law given Moses. You have to quote Yahweh, in other words. Second is you have this saying that every government has to be obeyed as if God gave it, because in fact these are agents of God. They're established by God. And denying rebelling against them is rebelling against God. So if you don't follow what the Nazis said to kill innocent Jewish people, supposedly, according to Paul, the false apostle, I'm going to tell you, it has to be false, because God would not have said you have a duty to kill all these Jewish people. That is false. Paul's not speaking for God because he is putting God behind what the Nazis did. That's what you have to believe Paul. And I don't believe that. Do you? Does anybody? It's a massacre. It's a massacre of innocent millions of people. But if you believe Paul, that was all God's doing. And therefore, Paul cannot be from God. He says, for the one in authority is God's servant for your good. No, he is not necessarily for my good. And you're talking about Roman people like the creep Nero, or all the emperors before him were just as bad. I mean, up to this point in time, it's not been a hero. Ever since Augustus Caesar, you've had a whole series of tyrants at Rome. What are you talking about, Paul? Are you living in an alternative universe? No, he believes this. They are servants, agents of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. A wrongdoer, in their view, in the Roman law, was not the same view of what God believes is a wrongdoer. The wrongdoer under Nazi law is not the same kind of wrongdoing that you and I think. Wrongdoer is someone who refuses to murder Jewish people, refuses to murder gypsies, refuses to kill the aged, the infirm, the terminally ill. Just go kill them. That was their rule. Euthanasia, get rid of them. It's costing us money. We're going to get rid of them. So, Paul, you're totally wrong. could not be from God. Okay, and we'll continue on. I just want to show you, in contrast to Paul's views, the apostles had a completely opposite view from Paul, and yet one consistent with God. Acts 5, verse 24. Now, when the high priest and the captain of the temple and the chief priests heard these things, then came one and told them, saying, Behold, the men whom you put in prison are standing in the temple and teaching the people. Then went the captain with the officers and brought them without violence. Verse 27. And when they had brought them, they sat them before the council. So this is the apostles. They had been preaching. They let them go, saying, we're commanding you, do not preach anymore about Jesus. Let them go. They didn't agree to it, but they let them go and gave them that command. Now they're going to pay the price for this. And then they want to be the Pharisees, the Sanhedrin, the religious rulers are going to now try to enforce their power. And let's see how the apostles react to that. Are they going to be submissive and say, "Oh, sure, we're not going to preach Jesus"? Let's see what they say. And when they had brought them, they set them before the council, and the high priest asked them, saying, Did not we straitly command you that you should not teach in this name? And behold, you have filled Jerusalem with your doctrine and intend to bring this man's blood upon us. Then Peter and the other apostles, so imagine 12 apostles, they can all say this in unison, answered and said, We ought to obey God rather than men. Well, these were your authorities, and not just any authority. These were the religious authorities who had right to tell you what to do, say, and believe. That's what they thought was their job, which isn't even in the Bible. So they were assuming authority is not allowed to them by God's law. But in any regard, is Paul is saying that anybody who's asserting authority over you by a public authority is appointed by God. But these people are rebuffed by the 12 saying, no, we have to obey God, not men. You are still men when you are just simply civil servants of a state or a religious system that you created yourselves at odds with God's anointing, meaning God did not anoint this process that they're going through, that they've created, the Sanhedrin or the high priest. The use of the high priest's power to rule and dictate how people must think and believe is something they made up. It's an oral law, if you will. The Sadducees were thought not to have any oral laws. Well, one thing they did have an oral law, which is they could enforce religious belief and punish you and condemn you for teaching doctrines they don't agree with. So we need to understand the Sanhedrin were not innocent of an oral law principle, and here we see it in action. Okay, so we'll get back now to the book, Mr. Bouck White. I just thought a little digression here would be useful because this was his comment about Paul, and then I wanted to follow up and show you how the law, where it came from Paul, and the opposing view from the apostles. Okay, so now we'll get back to... Okay, so here we continue. How Paul's writings supported change from democratic to tyrannical principles under Constantine. So thoroughgoing was Christianity changed from its original form of a democracy and awakening that the transformation shaped the New Testament when the canon of Scripture came to be made. The original simplicity of the gospel story was overlaid by explanatory glosses, which were interwoven into the text itself. Paul's pietism, and that word has a special meaning, by the way. It means reliance on faith experiences, not rigorous duties of a religious nature, like the law. It was given canonical authority by the inclusion of his writings and of writings colored by his spirit into the book. Christianity became so saturated with metaphysics and pietism, that is, faith experiences, not duties God gives you, that even a thinker so clear envisioned in other things as Seeley regards Paul and his fellow Hellenists as the essential heart of the New Testament. So, in other words, Bouck White is saying we've gotten so far away from the Bible, we now have something that's completely foreign to it inside of the Bible. And this is where he's going to comment on Constantine, or this man Seeley writes, when Christianity came forward in the age of Constantine to lead the thought of the empire, it presented a program in which liberty and nationality were omitted. A noble life had before been necessarily free in public life, but the New Testament shows how virtue may live under the yoke of an absolute government and in complete retirement from politics. Thus, the age was made somewhat happier by receding somewhat further from liberty. Tyranny was more cruel and misery was more widespread, but it was less felt because the age had occupations which absorbed it and was possessed with thoughts which, in a measure, numbed the sense of pain. So Christianity was now just used as a sort of antidote against having to live under tyranny. And now it was the tyranny was mixed with religion. And that's really what Constantinian Christianity was all about. Now it was a tyranny, and it had a religious theory that was that it was claiming to co-opt and control, and that was Christianity. Here it goes, page 260. We prefer the testimony of Nietzsche as to Christianity's inmost meaning and essence. So rather than what Constantine did to us, he's going to say, let's listen to an adversary, basically, of Christianity, telling us the danger of Christianity, true, original Christianity. He says this. So Nietzsche is a staunch advocate of fist government, meaning use your fist government over the common people. He warned the ruling oligarchy against Christianity in its primitive form as their arch enemy. Now, this means primitive means before Paul tampered with our doctrines, or at least before Constantine used Paul to tamper with Christ's doctrines. His rage against the democratizing spirit of the Carpenter betrayed him into heats which go beyond veracity. So Nietzsche goes crazy because he hates Christ, right? Nevertheless, despite the excess of damnatory epithets, the picture of primitive and essential Christianity, which here follows, has truth above that drawn by CLI. Says Nietzsche the following, quote, the poison of the teaching of equal rights for all has been spread abroad by Christianity more than by anything else. As a matter of principle, Christianity has, from the most secret recesses of bad instincts, waged a deadly war against every sentiment of reverence and distance between man and man. Now, what he means is, if there's supposed to be distinctions between, if we're all equal, that means there's no distinctions. We all have equal rights. He's saying that's just deplorable. That's, they have no reverence for the distance that should exist between man and man, or woman and woman, or man and woman. Let us not underestimate the calamity which, proceeding from the Christianity, has insinuated itself even into politics. At present, nobody has any longer the courage for separate rights. That means Nietzsche means there he prefers separate but superior rights, meaning, remember the doctrine, separate but equal, according to, there was a U.S. Supreme Court decision said separate equal was a good thing. No, it isn't. It's abhorrent. There's no such thing. If you're separate, you don't have equal rights. If you're forced to be separate, you can't share things equally, then you don't have equal rights. At present, nobody has any longer the courage for separate rights. Nietzsche prefers separate rights. For rights of domination, there's nobody respects rights of domination anymore either. And that means the rights of one class or group to rule over other classes or groups. So Nietzsche is all in favor of that. Remember, he's the guy who believes in the Superman. He hopes that one day we'll develop a super race. This is where Hitler got all his ideas. So what Bouck White is doing is saying, let's look at what an enemy of Christianity even recognizes is the threat of Christianity, not Pauline Christianity, but the original Christianity. And that Christianity teaches equal rights among men and dignity of each individual, poor or rich. And he goes on. And if the belief in the privilege of many makes revolutions and will continue to make them, it is Christianity. Let us not doubt it. Now, this is Nietzsche still talking. Christianity is going to be the cause of revolution. It is Christian valuations which translate every revolution merely into blood and crime. Christianity is a revolt of all that creeps on the ground against what is elevated. So, in other words, Christianity is like this creepy crawly bug on the floor, and you just want to step on it and make it go away, because this is bad, because it's going to create equality of rights. It's going to get rid of separate but equal. It's going to not allow one class to dominate another class. I mean, so Nietzsche is all in favor of, this was based on Darwinism, by the way, that basically somebody has to rise above the others and wipe out the others, and that proves who's more superior, whoever can survive. And this is just the animalistic solution to everything. Now here's Roman Christianity taught empire and affixed its pagan religion to it. So this is now, he's getting back to his Bouck White's discussion. Page 262. Accordingly, we find the church suppressing every tendency to independence of thought. For this holy Roman Empire, let it be emphasized, was naught but Rome's old empire of property, with religious sanctions added to it as a sort of ghostly police. So I just want to pause there. What he's talking about, the Holy Roman Empire, is what emerges out of the Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire. And so he's saying this is nothing more than a continuation of the empire that existed under the Byzantine Empire or the Roman Empire in the West that preceded it but collapsed in the middle into the Dark Ages. Intimidation by means of the greater anathema had been found more effective than the former method of intimidation by armed cohorts. So the Holy Roman Empire was using religion now to control people. Soldiery can work upon the people only from the outside, and it's mechanical at best. But the church, with its awe-inspiring liturgy and its infinitive reserves of damnation, kept fear alive in every heart. It beat down the seditious prompting while it was yet but a thought, and ere it had come to birth indeed. I just wanted to now jump in here and give you a book. It's called Anarchy and Christianity by Jacques Ellul from 1988. And he has an interesting thing at page 28 that mentions this. From the days of Constantine, and for many years, serious historians have doubted the sincerity of his conversion, viewing it as a purely political act. Indeed, of course it was. The state has supposedly been Christian. The church has received great help in return. Thus, the state has aided it in forcing people to become Christians. It has given it important subsidies. It has safeguarded its cultic sites. It has granted privileges to the clergy. What he's saying is Constantine did all these things seemingly friendly. We're going to aid you to force people to become Christians. And we're thinking, we should have thought, like, how can people be forced to become Christians? It's something that should be voluntary. But you know what? He's willing to help us. So I guess it'll grow our church. It has given it important subsidies. So now this is the key. Constantine put created the priest class now, and then said, I'm going to put you on regular salaries. And so he basically co-opted them. This was an advantage to go along with what he's saying in your pocketbook. Constantinian Rome, had safeguarded its cultic sites, meaning whatever our sites were, they would go, we're going to protect the place where Jesus was crucified. We'll create a church there. And by the way, they put it on the Church of Venus, and it was the wrong spot. And there's a whole book on that. It's very interesting, called Golgotha. It has safeguarded its cultic sites. It has granted privileges to the clergy. But the church has also had to let the emperor meddle in its theology. When did that happen? At Nicaea. Decided times, what must it be its true doctrine? When did that happen? At Nicaea. Summon councils. When did that happen? Nicaea. Supervise the appointment of bishops. Well, that came later. The church also had to support the state. Well, now Constantine expected something in return. The alliance of throne and altar does not date from the Reformation, but from the 5th century. And I'd say that means he's thinking like the 400s, but Constantine Christianity is from the 300s, and it became a permanent fusion of state and government by 381 under Theodosius. Maybe that's what he's thinking of. Anyway, now I want to point out one more thing, because when you go read this book on anarchy and Christianity, you learn a few things about the Bible that you might not know about. That's very important. When Moses created the Exodus, not created, but he was the leader of the Exodus. The resulting society, when they got to Canaan, eventually was a society that there was no ruler. Moses died on the hill and didn't even get to go into Canaan. Now the people are all there, and they've had to fight a couple military battles through Joshua and others, and they end up having no ruler, no government. And this went on for many hundreds of years. And what happened initially is the God of Israel declared that he, and this is from the book at page 46, that he and he alone would be Israel's head. Yet this was not a theocracy, for God had no representative on earth, and tribal assemblies made the decisions. So God was saying, he basically said in the law, he said, you should have no king at all. But if you choose a king, let me choose the king. And so that was all it says in Deuteronomy about kings. Don't have a king, but if you insist, you insist let you have a king, you can, but only if I get to appoint that king. So God actually, contemplated they'd want that, but he wanted it to be known in principle, I don't like you to have kings. Okay, now I'm going to show you why David was so unique, and why Jesus fits this role, and why God allows Jesus to be our king. We'll see in a minute. A significant phrase at the end of the book of Judges 21:25 is that at the time that there was no king in Israel, people did what was right in their own eyes. And again, the book of Judges period, I think, if I'm recollect, is 400 years. Okay, 400 years. Excuse me, the book of Judges is 400 years of no kings. Then there was a man named Abimelech. He wanted to be king. He would have been the first king. And prophet Jotham came out and said, look, everybody, he's going to do all these bad things. You're gonna have taxes. He's going to raise armies with you. You don't want that. Stick with God. Stick with God alone. And eventually, that's what ended up happening. I think Abimelech got killed, and that took care of that. But eventually, you get Saul, and God allows Saul. Saul goes mad. He's tormented by a demon, and so on and so forth. And then the next king, the second king of Israel, is David. Now, many of us forget that David did a lot of evil by the end of his career. He killed rivals. He arranged the death of a husband of a woman whom he desired, a married woman, and he had incessant civil wars of his reign. And he was not a good king at a certain point in time, not a good person. But before that time, he was a very good person. He was extremely good. He's exactly what God wanted, and God makes a promise to him that from your lineage will come a king who will be the Messiah, basically. I'm just shortening it up. So what was the point? What made him good? And we don't hear about this from anybody 99% of the time. And I just saw it today and it reminded me, because I've read this book before and I didn't remember it anymore, this part. Listen to this. A first reason is that the reason that God loved David is referenced in 2 Samuel 12, verses 7 to 9. It shows us that David did nothing on his own. It was God alone who acted through him. Do you remember when Jesus says, I can do nothing of my own? All what I do is what I see my Father doing, and then I do what he's doing. Do you see? That's how Jesus saw the good that the obedience of David that made David worthy of having a son who would become the Messiah, who would rule over all of Israel for all time, was the early David, not the later David. The later David is not a good guy. He's a murderer and adulterer, okay? And he has to repent of those things, but he's not going to get all the benefits. But God is recognizing the part of David that was good, and that's what Jesus is going to do. He's going to just follow when David was good. He's going to emulate that David, not the David who murders and has adultery and all that. No, that's not the person. That's not what God intended for Jesus. He intended him to be this early David. And that's very important because that tells us why Jesus is so unique and why we can have someone who fits perfectly into being a king that God would want when even God didn't want kings to begin with. And I think I'm gonna wrap it up here. There's more I could do, but I'm gonna make it this will be the end of the episode. Just listen to this. It's interesting, just a technical fact. 262. Rome, from the earliest times, its patrician class in Rome had early taken the precaution of keeping the office of Pontifex Maximus in their hands. Remember, I told you that Constantine was the Pontifex Maximus, and that was a role that meant he would rule over all religions, pagan and Christian, and including Christian, every religion, just by being having the office of Pontifex Maximus. Well, when did this happen? This supreme priest had his official residence beside the bridge crossing the Tiber. So this is an office that existed near the Tiber River. The office carried with it large revenues. So because this office was managing all the religions, it could spend money on the religions. Did you see what they were doing? They were controlling the religions through money. Now, when I saw this, I go, okay, now that explains a lot. Because when the Christians come on board in 325, Constantine begins paid salaries for the clergy. So Rome had all along had this plan as a system of government with the religions, the pagan religions, of funding them and funding their sacrifices and all of that. And so there was a huge amount of money flowing through this office to keep control of the people. It was, moreover, a post of influence. By declaring that the auguries were unfavorable, the pontiff was able at any time to stop public business. So the Pontifex Maximus also had great influence when there was obviously a time when it was not an office that was run by an emperor. So it was a true office at one time, and then he goes through the history of one of the emperors purchased the office, and so basically it was now the emperor could get extra money into his coffers from the government when he served this role of Pontifex Maximus. So the budget had already been established prior to the emperors, and that budget would increase for purposes of religious control, government control of religion, of all religions, by funding all of them at the same time so they can control and manipulate them. So anybody who doesn't see this issue, by the way, about Constantine doesn't understand how what he was doing was nothing different than any emperor had done before him. Could you imagine if in our country today every religion religion of any denomination was getting money from the government, I mean direct cash, that a single person back in Washington, D.C. could control the spigots of money coming and going, because religion can exist without the money. So the religion could be denied cash, and it'll continue. As we know, that there'll be people who want to support it, and the government knows that, but the government wouldn't have any influence if it doesn't keep giving that church or religion or religious system money. So that's why Rome did this, to keep influence over religion. And by the way, one of the things I think we need to get rid of in our country is tax deductions to religious organizations, because this gives an undue weight onto systems, to affixing yourself to a religious system. And basically, if you, it's subsidizing belief systems, all of them equally, as long as they're not crazy, and there's certain, but even crazy churches apparently get deductions. So that it's just simply, we should not be in the business of subsidizing religion and doing exactly what the Romans did. It allows manipulation in the end, but not as bad as when you're controlling actual cash going into some place. That's very different. Okay, I'm going to end episode 2 as be the final episode. I thought there's more you can read online in the article, but I hope this helps us to get a better understanding of how people can view Jesus positively, and at the same time be anti-Paul. And it meshes together perfectly, because Paul does not mesh well with Jesus. He's completely different in outlook, and clearly his view of the law. The law. Well, yes, the law of the state you live in is from God in all situations, no matter how horrible and evil it is. He makes no exception, and that is exactly why Luther was insisting his fellow Germans obey the commandments to kill Christians. So there was a whole thing. The Peasant War involved Christians going in revolt because they wanted to have their own churches not controlled by the government, and the government, the Catholic kings didn't want any Protestant denominations. And believe it or not, Luther backed them, saying, relying on Romans 13, 1-4. It's in his epistle, on his letter about the ravening hordes. I think he called it, I can't remember the word, but the hordes of the evil peasants, and basically licensed the German rulers to persecute and kill over 100,000 Christians are on Luther's death roll from his early point in his life. He permitted that, he endorsed it, and 100,000 people were put to death because they were just seeking to be, they're called peasants. They were just seeking to have their own churches. That's it. That's all they were trying to do. Well, they had a program of about 12 different things, but all of them were reasonable requests for being exempt from certain duties of being, having to give up their property so the government could do something with the armies and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, okay, so I hope this helped everybody get a better perspective on Paul's views about government being completely at odds with Jesus, and Jesus's views being much more democratic, very much more according to what we saw there about the people of the early Judges period, where you didn't even have a king, you didn't have any rulers. And so Jesus was trying to establish an idea of really a king who's benevolent, who does exactly what David did, which was to only obey what God says. And God has very easy commandments to follow. They're not difficult. And and you were much better off if you just have God ruling you through a man who's completely obeying God and doing no more than what God authorizes him to do. That would have been perfect. And David did a perfect job at that initially, but then, of course, failed later. But his initial obedience was fantastic and ideal, and exactly what Jesus says. When he was here, he was talking in the same way. And so that's why God chose him. He was perfect for the job. He had the right attitude and understood the role of a true Davidic Messiah. Okay, everybody. God bless. Take care. Ciao. Bye.